About a week after that is announced, they make the transfer of funds from Block 1 to the account that would later disperse funding to Eden. The key of that timing being that transfer was not made until after the settlement was rejected. I posted sort of my thoughts over on Substack, and I hope if you guys haven't had the chance to read it, that you do give it a read if you're interested in the situation. Essentially, last week, for those who aren't aware, Block 1 donated 500,000 EOS to Eden. And in a vacuum, it's good to get money from Block 1 into the hands of anything on EOS, because that would be, a big change of pace from Block 1. Historically, they have not done anything to support EOS, or done very little. But I had a problem with the way it was sort of represented to the community, in the sense that it was represented as if this was a donation done because they support decentralized governance, and that, we should be thankful that Block 1 is contributing, and so on and so forth. And that really bothered me, because from my vantage point, I was seeing through exactly what Block 1 is doing. It was really obvious to me what was going on from Block 1's perspective and why they chose to make this donation. And so I was pretty frustrated by the way it was presented to the community. And I think during the course of that, there was a lot of back and forth, which at certain points turned into, personal attacks or things that crossed the line in certain ways between either myself or other community members and members of Helios or other people who supported the donation and so on. And so I sort of wrote the article to really clear the air and explain what my thoughts are, to sort of reiterate a little bit from that article. And just before I do that, I just wanted to clarify, I don't have any ill will towards the Helios people, to Barnes, Waxa, Brock, or anyone who, was involved in facilitating this. I don't think that you guys are, working for Block 1 or something secret like that and trying to screw over EOS or anything along those lines. My point was essentially that I think in a certain way, Helios was being used by Block 1 to the detriment of the EOS community. So let's dig in a little bit to what I wrote about in that article. And so essentially, as everyone's really aware, when Block 1 had the ICO, they made three major promises, but I'm going to focus on one promise of those three. And that was that Block 1 would maintain the EOS.io code for a minimum of 10 years. I linked to the source for that in the article. And what ended up happening is less than 4 years after that promise was made, Block 1 stopped maintaining and updating the software. And the date at which they stopped maintaining and updating the software was May 2021. And that date is actually very interesting, because if you look about what also happened around that same time, Block 1 settled a class action lawsuit that dated back to the ICO and was in relation to the promises made during the ICO. And when a class action lawsuit is settled, essentially in certain circumstances, now this isn't a one-size-fits-all blanket rule, but it can apply this way. Essentially what may happen is it absolves you of any future legal liability for the same sort of situation. And so in essence, I believe that Block 1, when they settled the class action lawsuit, felt that claims related to the ICO and the promises made during the ICO no longer are applicable, because they had settled and absolved themselves of any responsibility. So what they offered was a $25 million settlement. During the course of the ICO, Block 1 made other promises other than maintaining the software. They promised to invest $1 billion directly into EOS projects. They promised to deploy the majority of the capital earned through the token sale back into the hands of the innovators, as Brendan put it, which is essentially he was implying or stating directly that it would go into EOS.io ecosystem. Whatever those promises may have been, I think that everyone with sort of common sense can agree that Block 1 did not adhere to them. But the most damning one is the lack of code updates, because that's not a subjective determination. That is a factual thing that you can see on the GitHub. When did they start or stop maintaining the code? And so again, May 2021, so that's a relevant date. May 2021, they stopped maintaining the code. If you look at Block 1's website, about a week or two after that, their last update to the code base, they announced that they settled the class action lawsuit tentative to a court's approval for $25 million. So tentative to the court approval, it was settled in their view. And they assumed, I suspect, that that was a rubber stamp, that it was guaranteed that the court was going to approve of it. I think everyone in their right mind, for the most part at least, assumed that was going to be the case. I assumed that was going to be the case personally. Fast forward to August 2022, a year later, and a judge threw out that settlement offer. They rejected it. And by rejecting it, they essentially had said or implied that now Block One is back open to legal vulnerability. In other words, what Block One believed was a closed case is now an open case. And so that happens in August 2022. About a week after that is announced, they make the transfer of funds from Block One to the account that would later disperse funding to Eden. The key of that timing being that transfer was not made until after the settlement was rejected. So if you haven't followed the case, you're probably wondering, okay, what's the big deal here and so on? So the settlement was rejected and then they made the transfer, whatever. Okay, so here's what's going on. In my opinion, this is what I think Block One's legal strategy is. I don't know definitively. This isn't legal advice. This isn't a guarantee. I don't have direct knowledge of anything. But I believe what happened is Block One felt that they no longer had to adhere to the promises they made during the ICO when they settled. To their surprise, the settlement was rejected. And then they felt very vulnerable to legal action because a door they thought was closed is now opened. As a result, they said, okay, well, what do we do here? I think one of the things that may have been happening beforehand, after, I don't know when, but they worked out this deal in conjunction with Helios to direct funds to Eden, which is a good thing. They probably, I suspect, in the future will make other donations along those lines, maybe funding Helios, maybe funding Pomelo, maybe funding the Antelope Coalition. That's what I expect to see from Block One in the future. And I suspect they have roughly $25 million budgeted towards these type of endeavors. The reason I suspect they have $25 million budgeted is essentially because that is the amount they would have settled the class action for. In other words, they were willing to pay $25 million to absolve themselves of legal responsibility for the promises made during the ICO. But the promises made during the ICO is they would deploy billions of dollars. So they paid $25 million to not have to pay billions. That's a pretty good deal for Block One. So some people said, okay, well, just because they make a donation doesn't prevent them from being sued or anything like that, and that's true. But I think one counter to that is that by sort of welcoming Block One back into the EOS community, saying, shucks, we'll move on, we'll move forward, thanks for the support, and so on and so forth, that feeds into Block One's plan. Because by doing so, they can demonstrate to a court they're accepted by the EOS community, they intend to fulfill the promises, it's just taking longer than maybe expected, and so on and so forth. So essentially, my point is that the community has a golden opportunity to get what they are owed back. But it sounds like Block One is doing what they can to minimize the amount they return. And so that is really what I'm getting at.